As if I didn't already have enough projects to work on, I picked up yet another one. This is the Kyosho Inferno 10. This is just kind of what you do when you can't go racing for the time being because you have a baby that you need to take care of. So, getting to the point here, lately I've been on this kind of a kick, if you will, of trying to find vintage nitro cars, 1/10 scale nitro cars that can be converted to electric. And the very first one that I did was the RC10 GT. I turned that into a GTE, if you want to call it that. And that was a readily made conversion with a motor mount made by Dynotech. I took it racing. I made plenty of videos of that. Very good mid-motor truck. The next one I did was the Kyosho Rampage Pro, which I've done the rolling chassis conversion. I just haven't none of the electronics in the body and everything. But that was more or less a successful kit, if you will, or build. And after that, I picked up Traxxas Nitro Street Hawk. I honestly haven't even gotten started on that for a few different reasons. Partly because I want to try to stick with the Kyosho stuff for the time being. So I figured, okay, well, are there any nitro four-wheel drive buggies out there that are 1/10 scale and vintage that can be converted to electric? And it turns out there is, the Kyosho Inferno 10. The Inferno 10 was made in 1993, if I have my understanding correct, and it shares some components with the Kyosho Laser of that time. That would be the Laser ZX, the ZXR, and the ZXRR. It doesn't share a whole lot, but it does share the front and rear suspension arms, the front caster blocks, the front steering knuckles, and the rear hub carriers, and I guess you could say the front and rear shocks, although these exact shocks are plastic shock body. The Laser had either gold shock body with, I think, the ZX, or with later models, I think they came with more of like a grayish aluminum shock body, if I remember correctly. The dog bones are probably the same length as what you would have in a Laser, but these are actual dog bones. They're not universals. So, but by the way, it's both front and rear. Dog bones in the front, dog bones in the rear. So, one thing that comes to mind is just taking, you know, modern Laser universals, CVAs, and putting them in there. If I had to guess, maybe a 65mm universal or a 62.5mm. I haven't measured it out, but that's probably around what you would need for a universal conversion rather than using these dog bones here. But everything else is kind of bespoke to this kit. The steering rack is, I think, its own steering rack, although, you know, it shares it with other chassis of this type, like the RS200, and I think the GP10, they had a similar kind of layout. They were nitro 1/10 scale four-wheel drive cars. But as far as sharing parts with the Laser, it's really just the arms, the hubs, and the caster blocks, and that's about it. What makes this interesting to me is that this has gear diffs, 3 gear differentials. It has a front gear diff, a rear gear diff, and a center gear diff, which is kind of like what you would get in a modern 1/10 scale four-wheel drive buggy, like the Hot Buddies or the Techno. I think the Techno comes with, or can come with, a center diff. Certainly the 8 scale cars come with center diffs. The associated B44.3 also has a center diff. I think the B64, some variant of it, has a center diff. So very useful for, say, lower grip surfaces. You can tune the center diff. And by the way, these 3 gear diffs are oil filled. They're not like the old Tamiya gear diffs that you would have in a TA02 or a Top Force or something like that, where you just put a little bit of grease in there and that kind of holds the diff together, or you know, it controls the diff action. These are actually tunable with diff oil, although there are no seals between the diff housing and the diff gear that screws into the other side to close everything up. It's just those 2 parts. So hopefully that's a good enough excuse me, hopefully that's a good enough seal to hold the actual oil in. We'll have to see if I can ever actually do the conversion and get it running and do some kind of long-term testing. But apparently, you know, that seemed to have worked at the time that this car was running back in the 90s. And I seem to have found a really good example here. Very, very good condition. There are a few changes that I'll make other than the electric conversion, which I'll get to momentarily. The first one would be the underside of the chassis. All of the screws that came with the kit, I think these are all stock screws. They have button heads, which means they protrude out from the bottom of the chassis. And I guess if you're running a high enough ride height, it doesn't matter. But if you're running on a smooth track surface, you don't want stuff scraping the track and messing up the track. And smoother tracks tend to have higher grip, so you're running lower ride height, so you're more likely to scrape the track anyway. So any of the screw holes that I would have to use here, I'll need to countersink them and use countersunk flathead screws to replace these screws here to make everything nice and flat and flush. I have to get a front bumper for this. I might just make one out of whatever material I have. It shouldn't be too difficult. And you can see here, by the way, that's an opening that shows the gear diff. There's one there, and of course this cover here, it covers a similar opening in the rear. Okay, so other things to point out are the relative adjustability of the chassis is actually, you could say, compared to something like a Yokomo YZ10, maybe slightly more adjustable. You have a few options here for front camber gain and a little bit of roll center, especially at the front caster block here, although it's hard to see with all the black parts. There's a hole here right around this point. Let me see if I can just do it here. Right here there's a hole, okay? There's another hole here, and then there's another hole still over here. Now this hole, apparently the way this car was set up was this hole doubles as the Kingpin hole that goes into the steering knuckle. So if you want to use a longer link to go out to this hole, you'd have to actually use a separate Kingpin here and then screw this into this hole here. There are essentially 3 holes here on the caster block that you could in principle use to adjust front camber gain and roll center, by the way, by putting spacers under these, plus a couple of holes here on the front tower, and then on the rear you have if you're familiar with the rear hub carriers on the Kyosho Laser, there's essentially 6 holes, 3 high holes and 3 low holes, plus all of these holes here on the rear tower. If I could get these reproduced in carbon fiber, I might have a few more holes added to the inside, maybe 1 more hole on the bottom and 2 more on the top here, and maybe remove this hole or move it up or something. But even without that, there's plenty of adjustability here for roll center and camber gain. The Yokomo YZ10 didn't, in any variant, whether it's the 870C or the Works models or the 94 and 95 models, they didn't have a whole lot of adjustability for roll center and camber gain because of how certainly the outer camber link mounted to either of the front caster block or the rear hub carrier. And then on the shock towers themselves, there were maybe 2 holes on the front tower and 1 or 2 holes on the rear tower, depending on the model you had. The 95 YZ10 had an extra camber link plate that you could get to give you a few more mounting options for the inner camber link on the rear. So you had some adjustability, and to be fair, I love the YZ10. It's probably my favorite car of all time. You didn't really need all of that adjustability because the stock setting was already really good. I don't know exactly with this car if the available holes are adequate for, say, modern smooth tracks. We'll just have to see. One thing that also stands out in terms of adjustability is a lack of adjustability in terms of rear toe-in and anti-squat and front arm sweep, as well as front kick-up. Now, again, to be fair, these were not options that you would typically have on an older 1/10 scale 4-wheel drive buggy. The YZ10 certainly didn't have it. I don't think the XX4 had those options either. The Schumacher Cat 2000, which I'm rebuilding one right there, that was probably the most adjustable among the older 4-wheel drive buggies that did have rear toe-in adjustability and front kick-up adjustability, although they called it rake, and a few other options for adjustability that you didn't have on some of the other 110 scale four-wheel drive buggies. So all things considered, in terms of adjustability, this car is, you could say, par for the course, maybe slightly above average. Especially if you consider the center gear diff on this particular car, that you could say that makes it a little bit more adjustable than some of the older cars that just had a front and a rear diff and a slipper clutch. Okay. What's also interesting about this car, as far as vintage four-wheel drive goes, is that it's shaft drive, because it's a nitro-powered car, and you know, the clutch bell runs this way, so it has to mate with center gear diff this way. That means it has to drive shafts, both front and rear, toward the gearboxes. So in essence, assuming you can convert this to an electric car, it's going to look quite a lot like a modern Laser ZX 6.6, which is kind of neat. Okay, so what else do I want to mention here before getting to the conversion bits? Maybe the steering rack is something I might want to change, or at least try to update, because this steering rack might be hard to find in terms of getting, you know, replacement steering racks. Maybe it's possible to fit a ZX6 steering rack onto this assembly with a little bit of modification, which if so, that would be great, because those parts are very readily available. And if I can make that work, of course, I'll make a video about that in time. The other thing is, it has to do with the way the towers mount, especially the front tower here. So to get to the towers, essentially they mount onto the gearbox, and the gearbox and the bulkhead are one piece, if you will. There's a left and a right half, and then a back cover. So the back cover is essentially where the rear bevel gear kind of goes through, and then that screws onto the two halves of the gearbox, so that bevel gear can mate with the differential bevel gear. Okay, and then these two left and right halves are kind of intricate in that they comprise both of the bulkhead that the shock tower mounts onto, as well as the inner suspension arm hinge pin mounting points. So this is all kind of one part. So if you if you happen to hit something really hard and you break the hinge pin mounting point, you have to replace the gearbox, which means tearing all of this apart just to replace the gearbox. Same thing for the rear, by the way. Rear gearbox halves, two left and right halves, and then a front cover here. The hinge pin mounting points are part of the gearbox assembly, and the rear tower mounts onto the gearbox assembly as well. So in some ways you could say that's good, because it minimizes the total number of parts that go into the car. In other ways it's bad, because if you break one thing, you have to replace something that a lot of parts connect to. So it's not quite as modular as a modern four-wheel drive buggy. It's kind of unfortunate. What I do worry about is the fact that the front tower mounts onto the rear gearbox, the front bulkhead and the front gearbox, using only these two holes here, this left hole and this right hole. And although there's a fair amount of material here, I suppose if you're not a very good driver and you flip the car over and you hit hard enough on the front, it could snap one or both of these two ears here. So maybe one way to address that, I was thinking, is this little additional ear here that the inner camber link mounts to is actually, that hole is perfectly aligned with one of the holes on the tower. So you could, say, take this ball cup and this ball end here and mount it in the middle here, and use some spacers to fill the gap, and then, you know, use like a screw and a lock nut to hold everything together on this side, and repeat the same thing on the other side. So at least that way the tower effectively mounts onto the gearbox using 4 mounting points. That should make it a little bit stronger, or it should make you less likely to break the gearbox in the event of an accident or a collision. So that's something else to think about. As far as the electric conversion is concerned, initially I was worried that I wouldn't have a really good way of doing this, and I'm collaborating with someone on sort of this conversion, thinking of ways to do it. And we were initially thinking of, you know, maybe building a custom lower deck out of carbon fiber, and then setting it up so that you can have holes specifically aligned to fit like a Laser ZX6 center lay shaft with a slipper clutch assembly and all the modern stuff but then you'd have to worry about whether the front and rear dog bones are the right length to mate to that center lay shaft for a modern car that might not be exactly as long or as short as what you get here with the stock parts. So that would be the bad part about it, or the uncertainty about it. The good thing is that uses 48 pitch gears, and so you have a wide pinion gear selection. This uses a Mod 1 spur gear, okay, and this is the only spur gear tooth count for this assembly as far as I'm aware. So you get one spur gear and that's it. And Mod 1 pinions are basically 8th scale pinions, and so usually they don't fit on 540 size motors with 1/8 inch output shaft diameter. But Kyosho does happen to make Mod 1 pinion gears of 3 sizes, a 10 tooth, a 12 tooth, and a 13 tooth that fit on 1/8 inch output shafts that are perfect for a 540 motor. So at least you have 3 gearing options. It's kind of limited, but it's something. So then the next part is figuring out the actual motor mount itself. Initially I wasn't sure how to do that, but it turns out that the Kyosho DBX VE, which is a model that is presently in production, it has, for whatever reason, a motor mount that's kind of a flat piece and then a vertical piece like this, and the motor mounts onto the vertical piece, and it's all kind of one integrated unit, and you just mount that onto the chassis, and the mounting holes to the chassis have little slots in them, so you can basically slide the motor mount itself in and out to adjust the gear mesh between the pinion and the spur. So that looks like the part that I'll use to convert this to electric. The question is where to mount the motor. Do I mount it so that the motor is on this side facing the back, or on the back facing the front, or do I mount it, I can't mount it here because that's where the steering servo goes, do I mount it over this way? So there are 3 options for mounting the motor, and part of it, the answer will effectively depend on where do I have space to drill holes. If I try to mount the motor on this side here, so that it's in the back facing forward, then the motor mount would have to fit kind of here somewhere, okay? And you can go look it up. I don't have the image, available, but if you look for that part, you'll see what I mean. And I think the problem with mounting the motor that way could be that there's this big honking hole right here that was originally designed to assist in starting this nitro engine, okay, if you have like a box starter. But I won't need that hole. But that hole could be positioned such that I won't be able to drill enough extra holes and align that motor mount just right so that I can, say, mount the electric motor in the back here. So I may have to either, if I put the motor mount here, it may or may not work. I may not have enough space with the output shaft to run the pinion to mate perfectly with the spur gear. So I'm not sure if I can mount it on either side here. One possibility would be to mount it on this side, because there is plenty of space here for me to drill some holes for that motor mount, and I could potentially put the motor over there, which would be putting it on this side here. And I would have to check to make sure that the direction of rotation is correct, so that if I did mount the motor on this side, that when I apply forward throttle, it's actually moving the car forward and not backward. I have to double check that. So there are a few things that I have to work out in terms of the motor mount, but I think I have a solution in mind that I will be able to use. And if that does work, then that would be awesome, because then you could have essentially a vintage four-wheel drive buggy with gear diffs, a center gear diff, shaft drive, and this may actually, I think, drive probably better than the old Laser, which was belt drive and had a very high friction drivetrain, because there were a lot of rollers, belt rollers in the gearboxes on that Laser, and it created a lot of drag. So this may actually be a better solution for a vintage Kyosho electric four-wheel drive buggy, but we'll have to see. I don't know when I'll be able to actually get to this project. I have a lot more time constraints this year than last year, but at least I wanted to share with you the idea that I have in my head for converting this to electric. And if you have an Inferno 10, give it a shot. Look up the Kyosho DBX VE motor mount, and you'll see what I mean when you look at the picture. It'll kind of make sense for being able to take that and possibly, mounting it onto the chassis somehow. It might work. So in the meantime, that's it. Thanks for watching.